Let me say, can I say one thing?
please.
To me, Stanley, the great Stanley Kubrick,
Yeah.
was an actor's enemy.
Well, he did 100 takes.
He was
per
an
shot.
actor's enemy. And I can point to movies that he's done, the worst performances I've ever seen in movies.
Robert Duvall has never been the type to keep his mouth shut when something bothers him. Throughout his long career in Hollywood, he built a reputation not just for his remarkable performances, but also for his willingness to say exactly what he thought, even when it meant criticizing some of the most celebrated names in the film industry. While other actors smiled for cameras and gave polished interviews full of compliments, Duvall took a different road. He said what he meant, named names, and stood by his words without apology. His entire philosophy about acting comes down to one thing: the craft must be respected. To Duvall, acting is not about stunts or tricks or showing off. It is about preparation, honesty, and being completely present in a scene. When he felt that someone, whether an actor or a director, was undermining that, he had no interest in pretending otherwise. And over the decades, there were quite a few people who fell into that category. Before we get into all of that, if you find this kind of content interesting, stories about what really goes on behind the scenes in Hollywood, the real relationships, the tensions, the unfiltered opinions that rarely make it into mainstream interviews, then consider subscribing to this channel. We dig into the stories that go beyond the surface, and there is a lot more where this came from. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Now, let us get into it. The first and perhaps most famous target of Duvall's criticism is someone most people would expect to be untouchable: Marlon Brando. In most conversations about acting, Brando is treated almost like a god. People talk about him in hushed, reverent tones, describing his work as transformative, revolutionary, and unrepeatable. Robert Duvall did not see it that way, at least not entirely. The two men worked together on one of the most celebrated films ever made, Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather in 1972. Duvall played Tom Hagen, the quiet and composed consigliere of the Corleone family, while Brando played the iconic Don Vito Corleone. On screen, their chemistry was undeniable. Behind the scenes, it was a very different story. Duvall watched Brando closely during that production and came away with serious reservations about the man's work ethic and behavior on set. One of the things that bothered him most was Brando's famous use of cue cards. Rather than memorizing his lines like most professional actors would, Brando preferred to have his dialogue written out and placed somewhere he could read it during a scene. Sometimes those cards were taped to objects around the set. Sometimes, and this is the part that really got under Duvall's skin, Brando would ask other actors to have lines written on their bodies so he could read them while looking at the person he was supposedly having a conversation with. When Duvall spoke about this in a 2022 interview with the AV Club, marking the 50th anniversary of The Godfather, he did not sugarcoat his opinion. He acknowledged that some people argued the cue cards helped Brando stay spontaneous, freeing him from the rigidity of memorized lines. Duvall said he partly believed that, but only partly. The other part, he said plainly, was laziness. That word, laziness, directed at Marlon Brando, was the kind of thing that made people's jaws drop. But Duvall meant it. He even admitted that he tried using cue cards himself at one point, presumably to understand what Brando was going for. He gave up on the idea quickly. His view was that if you know your lines perfectly, you're actually more free, not less. You can be completely in the moment, react naturally, go wherever the scene takes you, because the foundation is solid. You don't need a safety net if you've done the work. That was his argument, and it was a direct rebuke of Brando's approach. But the cue cards were only part of the problem. What troubled Duvall even more was how Brando behaved toward other actors on set, particularly younger or less established actors. According to Duvall, Brando had a habit of disrupting scenes when the focus was not on him, when the camera was pointed at someone else, when it was another actor's moment. Brando would allegedly do things that distracted or undermined the person whose scene it was. Duvall saw this as deeply destructive, a form of ego that had no place in the collaborative world of filmmaking. He went so far as to call Brando an actor's enemy, which is about as harsh a label as one professional could put on another. This was not a throwaway comment made in the heat of the moment. Duvall repeated this sentiment in multiple interviews and clearly believed it. He was not dismissing Brando's talent entirely. He acknowledged that he had been revolutionary, that his naturalistic approach had genuinely changed the way people thought about screen acting. But acknowledging impact is not the same as forgiving what Duvall saw as a fundamental disrespect for the craft and for fellow actors. Brando passed away in 2004 and never publicly responded to Duvall's criticisms. His silence meant his unconventional methods remained his only defense. For Duvall, though, the issue was never really personal in the petty sense. It was about values. His belief in discipline, preparation, and mutual respect on set stood in direct contrast to what he witnessed from Brando, and no amount of legendary status could make him pretend otherwise. From one legend to another, Duvall's views on Stanley Kubrick are equally surprising and equally firm. Kubrick is generally regarded as one of the greatest directors who ever lived. Films like 2001: A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, and Eyes Wide Shut are studied in film schools around the world. His visual style, his attention to detail, his ability to create atmosphere are considered nearly unmatched. And yet, when Robert Duvall was asked about him at the Hollywood Reporter's 2010 Awards Roundtable, he called Kubrick an actor's enemy. The phrase is striking partly because it is the same one he used about Brando, which tells you something about how serious Duvall considered this category of offense. But while his criticism of Brando was rooted in personal observation on a shared set, his criticism of Kubrick was based on what he saw in the work itself and what he knew about how Kubrick worked with actors. Kubrick was famously obsessive. He was known for demanding an extraordinary number of takes on a single shot or scene, sometimes asking actors to repeat the same moment dozens of times, and in extreme cases over 100 times. People who worked with him described the process as exhausting and sometimes psychologically grueling. Shelley Duvall, who starred in The Shining, famously had an extremely difficult experience on that production, with Kubrick allegedly pushing her to the point of illness to capture the distress he needed for her performance. Robert Duvall, watching from the outside, saw this approach as fundamentally wrong. His question was simple and devastating. How does a director know the difference between the first take and the 70th? If you cannot tell, he argued, then something has gone wrong in your process. A great director, in Duvall's view, knows exactly what they want. They communicate it clearly, they trust their actors, and they recognize a great performance when they see one. They do not grind people down through sheer repetition and hope that exhaustion somehow produces truth. To Duvall, what Kubrick's method actually produced was the opposite of authentic performance. It stripped actors of their energy, their instincts, and their spontaneity. It replaced genuine human emotion with robotic repetition, and the proof, he said, was right there on screen. He specifically named The Shining and A Clockwork Orange as examples of films with terrible performances, not in spite of Kubrick's direction, but because of it. He was careful to say that they might be great movies in terms of visuals and atmosphere and storytelling, but the performances, in his view, were among the worst he had ever seen. The room at that roundtable, filled with other actors including Ryan Gosling, reportedly reacted with a kind of stunned amusement. These were sacred cows being slaughtered in polite company, but Duvall did not back down. He was completely serious, and his argument had a clear logic to it, even if you disagreed with his conclusions. For him, acting is a living thing. It breathes and responds and exists in real time. When you force an actor to repeat a moment 60 times, you are not refining it, you are killing it. Moving on from the world of Stanley Kubrick, we come to a director who is far less discussed today, but who left a lasting impression on Duvall for very personal reasons. Henry Hathaway was a veteran Hollywood director who worked across several decades, with a career stretching back to the 1930s. By the time Duvall encountered him on the set of the 1969 Western True Grit, Hathaway was in his late 60s and very much a product of the old studio system, where directors held absolute authority and actors were expected to follow instructions without question. Duvall at this time was 38 years old and already had strong convictions about how acting should work. He had been trained in the method tradition, where performance comes from internal truth, from genuine emotional connection to a character, not from external commands or mechanical obedience. He believed in spontaneity, in allowing a scene to breathe and develop organically, in responding to what was actually happening in a moment, rather than executing a predetermined series of moves. Hathaway operated in a completely different universe. His approach was authoritarian. He told actors what to do and expected them to do it, full stop. There was no room for discussion, no space for the actor to explore or question or contribute creatively to a scene. You hit your mark, you said your line, you did it the way the director told you to, and that was the end of the conversation. The collision between these two approaches was inevitable. Duvall has spoken about one specific incident that captures the whole dynamic perfectly. At some point during filming, Hathaway shouted at Duvall, telling him that when the director said action, Duvall was to tense up. The instruction was not a suggestion or a piece of character guidance. It was a command, delivered with the kind of aggressive certainty that left no room for interpretation. For Duvall, being told to artificially tense up on command was the antithesis of everything he believed about acting. You cannot manufacture a genuine physical response. It has to come from somewhere real inside you. If you're just following an order to tense your body, the audience can see that it's hollow, that there is no truth behind it. The experience on True Grit left a deep mark. Years later, when Duvall spoke about directors he had not gotten along with, Hathaway's name came up with particular bitterness. He didn't even want to go into details. His exact words were effectively, "Henry Hathaway, we will not talk about him." That kind of refusal to engage, that desire to simply close the door on someone rather than re-examine the conflict, tells you more than a long explanation would. Some experiences leave wounds that never fully close, and Hathaway apparently was one of those experiences for Duvall. What makes this interesting is that True Grit is still remembered as a solid film, a film that earned John Wayne his only Academy Award. But for Duvall, the memory of making it is not about the final product. It's about what it felt like to work in conditions that violated everything he stood for as a performer. The fourth name on this list comes with a twist that makes it genuinely interesting. Bruce Beresford, the Australian filmmaker, directed Duvall in the 1983 drama Tender Mercies. That film earned Duvall his only Academy Award for Best Actor. You would think, then, that the memory of working with Beresford would be a positive one. You would be wrong, or at least not entirely right. Duvall's experience working with Beresford was marked by the same fundamental tension that defined his conflicts with Hathaway in Kubrick, though in a less explosive way. Where Hathaway had been aggressive and commanding, Beresford was more quietly controlling, more precisely restrictive. His approach to directing was highly precise, with a clear vision of exactly how each moment should look and feel, and a corresponding tendency to guide, or as Duvall experienced it, constrain his actors accordingly. For Duvall, this felt like micromanagement. Every gesture, every line reading seemed to be nudged and shaped until it fit within a predetermined framework. The fluid, instinctive quality that Duvall prized in his work, the sense that a performance was happening live and could go anywhere, was constantly being reined in. He felt like he was fighting to get something genuine onto the screen, while being pulled back towards something more controlled and calculated. The frustration was real, even if it never quite reached the boiling point that his conflict with Hathaway had. The process was draining, not because anyone was shouting, but because it required constant negotiation for space to breathe. In the end, of course, the result was extraordinary. Duvall's performance in Tender Mercies is genuinely one of the finest of his career, and the Academy recognized it. But the Oscar did not erase what the process had felt like. Duvall's experience of making the film, the daily battle for creative freedom, remained its own separate reality, independent of how the finished product was received. This is actually one of the more revealing things about Duvall as a person and as an artist. He does not measure an experience by its outcome. A great result does not retroactively make a difficult process good. The journey matters to him as much as the destination, maybe more, because the journey is where the actual work of acting happens. The fifth person on this list is someone Duvall never actually made a film with, which makes his presence here unusual, but no less telling. David Fincher became one of Hollywood's most celebrated directors on the strength of films like Seven, Fight Club, Zodiac, The Social Network, and Gone Girl. His reputation rests significantly on his obsessive attention to detail, his perfectionism, and his willingness to demand an enormous number of takes until a scene is exactly as he imagines it. Duvall's view of Fincher tracks almost perfectly with his view of Kubrick. He sees Fincher's method as fundamentally misguided, as a kind of torture masquerading as artistry. Demanding 40, 50, 60 takes from an actor is not, in Duvall's view, a path to better performance. It is a path to a dead performance. By the time you have done a scene 60 times, whatever was alive in it at the beginning has been worn away. What you are left with is technically precise and emotionally hollow. In the mid-90s, Duvall was apparently approached about appearing in Seven, the dark thriller starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman that went on to become a landmark film. Officially, his decision not to participate was attributed to scheduling conflicts, but Duvall later admitted that scheduling had little or nothing to do with it. The real reason, he said, was that he could not face the prospect of delivering the same line 60 times for a single shot. He suspected that even his decision to decline had been partly subconscious, that some part of him had steered away from the project before he had fully articulated to himself why. That confession is remarkably honest. Most actors would maintain the polite fiction of scheduling conflicts indefinitely. Duvall chose to be straight about it, which is consistent with everything else we know about him. He was not interested in protecting Fincher's feelings or maintaining diplomatic niceties. He had a genuine philosophical objection to the way Fincher worked, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The gap between their two visions of what filmmaking should be is stark. Fincher believes that truth is buried somewhere in repetition, that if you do a scene enough times, you eventually uncover its deepest, truest version. Duvall believes that truth is present from the beginning when an actor is prepared and trusted, and that repetition destroys rather than uncovers it. Neither of them is entirely wrong, and both approaches have produced undeniably powerful work, but they are genuinely incompatible philosophies, and Duvall was right to recognize that working under Fincher would have been for him personally a miserable experience. The sixth and final name on this list is the one that might surprise people the most because it comes with a complicated mix of professional respect and personal skepticism. Robert De Niro is, by almost any measure, one of the greatest film actors of the 20th century. His work in films like Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Deer Hunter, Goodfellas, and Cape Fear has secured his place in cinema history. He is also someone who shared significant professional space with Robert Duvall, most notably in The Godfather Part II, where both men appeared as part of the Corleone saga. And yet, when you ask Duvall about De Niro, what you get is not warmth or admiration. What you get is something cooler, more measured, and ultimately more dismissive than it might first appear. His most quoted line on the subject is, "He is good at playing Italians. Very good." On the surface, that sounds like a compliment. Listen a little harder, and you begin to hear what is underneath it. It is a compliment that simultaneously limits and diminishes. It says, within a certain type, within a certain lane, you do this well. It does not say, you are a great actor. It does not say, your range impresses me. It says, you are good at one thing. The root of Duvall's skepticism about De Niro lies in a fundamental disagreement about what acting is and what it should look like. De Niro is famous, perhaps more than any other American actor, for his commitment to physical and psychological transformation. For Raging Bull, he gained significant weight to play the older, heavier Jake LaMotta. For Taxi Driver, he learned to handle firearms and spent time with real cab drivers. For The Deer Hunter, he prepared extensively to understand the world of steelworkers. He is the poster child for a certain school of thought that says acting is transformation, that the most powerful performances come from the actor completely remaking themselves in the image of the character. Duvall finds this approach, if not exactly wrong, then certainly overhyped and potentially misleading. To him, the greatest performances are not the ones where you can see the most change or effort. They are the ones where something deeply true is communicated with the least apparent effort. The work, as he has said, is in the silence. It is in the moments between words, in the quality of listening, in the way a character inhabits a room without announcing themselves. Putting on weight or mastering an accent or shaving your head are externals. They might serve a performance, or they might just be impressive window dressing. The question is always whether something genuinely human and true is happening on the inside. Duvall once remarked that there is a danger in becoming a parody of yourself, particularly when you start believing your own myth. While he did not name De Niro directly in that comment, the context made the implication reasonably clear. As De Niro moved into the later stages of his career, taking on roles in broad comedies and franchise sequels, Duvall watched with what seems to have been a kind of sad confirmation of his earlier reservations. Here was a man whose early work had been extraordinary, but who had gradually leaned more and more into a version of himself as a brand, an icon, a recognizable type rather than a shape-shifting artist. De Niro has never responded to any of this with anything other than carefully measured politeness. When asked about Duvall, he has acknowledged him as a serious actor and expressed respect, while noting that they simply have different energies. That is probably the most graceful way to handle the situation. The two men have never had a public confrontation. There is no dramatic falling out to report. What there is, instead, is a quiet, persistent philosophical divide between two men who represent genuinely different schools of thought about what this whole business of acting is actually for. For Duvall, the entire body of his career represents a sustained argument for one kind of acting. It is an acting that is rooted in observation, in restraint, in the kind of deep preparation that paradoxically allows for complete spontaneity. His best performances, in The Godfather, in Apocalypse Now, in Tender Mercies, in The Apostle, in Get Low, share a quality that is very hard to describe, but very easy to feel. They feel like you are watching a real person, not a performance. There is no gap between the actor and the character. Everything looks effortless because the work happened somewhere you cannot see. That is what Duvall is defending when he criticizes Brando's laziness, Kubrick's successive takes, Hathaway's mechanical commands, Beresford's controlling precision, Fincher's relentless repetition, and De Niro's theatrical transformation. He is defending a vision of acting as something internal, disciplined, prepared, and ultimately human. He is arguing that the greatest thing an actor can do is disappear into truth so completely that the audience forgets they are watching a performance at all. Whether you agree with his specific judgments or not, and plenty of thoughtful people would push back on some of them, there is something genuinely admirable about the consistency of his position. Duvall has never changed his tune based on who was in the room or what was fashionable or who had the most Oscars on their mantelpiece. He has maintained his view of what good acting looks like and measured everyone he encountered against that standard, himself included. That kind of integrity is rare in any industry, and it is especially rare in one as driven by reputation and relationship management as Hollywood. Robert Duvall decided a long time ago that his loyalty was to the craft, and that loyalty has never wavered, regardless of the names attached to the disagreements that followed.